Cool. I think just let me know when I should begin, because currently it seems like less participants than registered.
Hi, Hadar. I think we can begin. There might be a few more people joining in, but they can come by later. So I think we can start.
Okay, sure. Let's begin. Okay. I'm going to share screen, although I will not lie, I did not prepare proper slides, partly because this is a bit more of an impromptu idea, and I will want to be in connection with you during this workshop to understand what you want to take out of it, partly because I think it combines two unrelated types of motions. These are vague motions and soft motions. So I'm going to share a document I made with some pointers for this workshop. And then I'll explain the structure of what we'll be doing. So basically, I'll start by going over the general framework of impacting and how do we impact. Then I'll make some more specific guidelines to do with what people often perceive as soft impacts. Then I'll move on to answer some questions that you guys submitted in advance before this workshop. And lastly, if time permits, we will also do practice together in a motion. Cool. So firstly, let's understand what impact is. Definitionally, impact is basically the part of the argument that answers the question, why do we care? While this is not the most accurate burden structure of an argument, and you might want to have a more specific burden structure per each argument, necessarily two components will always have to exist in any argument you have. Why is it true? And why is it important? In good or bad kind of important. This is something that might be familiar to those of you who take any of the liberal arts or whatever, the difference between a descriptive and a normative analysis. Descriptive is telling why something is, or what the world is, what happens factually. It describes a process. Normative is asking the question what should be. This is what we try to do in impacting. When we impact, we try to explain why all the analysis we provided of likelihood for our argument so far is not just true and stands, but important, why we should care about it, why it's good or bad. Specifically, a question that came, and I do think is a common confusion people often have, impacts are a necessary step on the way to make a weighing. They are not, however, a weighing in and of themselves. A weighing, and I will not delve too deeply into this because this is a topic for a separate workshop, but a weighing is basically impact plus comparative element. So if impact is saying why the argument is important, a weighing would say why an argument is more important than another argument in the debate, or why it's the most important argument in the debate. So this would be definitionally what an impact is. How do we go about proving the impact? The short answer is just like we prove anything else in debate. We analyze it. All of the classical methods that you already know how to use for analysis. Ask yourself why, and why is that true, and why is that true, until you reach some consensus and develop from there. Giving multiple reasons for your impact, for the why it's important aspect. Everything you do in regular analysis will apply for impacts as well. Importantly, impact is a part that should be analyzed usually. We don't just assert it, like we don't assert anything in a debate. Caveat is, in some debates, conveniently, the metric will be conceded by both sides. Everyone will agree on what is important and will only disagree on who wins it. In those cases, you don't have to analyze why your argument is important. You only have to prove that you win the metric everyone concedes. Before I go further, are there any questions on the definition of what an impact is? Okay, moving on then. As a general method of how we identify impacts, here, similarly, because impacts are just analysis, I would recommend the same general method that I recommend as how to come up with arguments or max or anything else. We start by mapping the stakeholders in a motion. Who are the main groups that are likely to be relevant? So to do a brief example together, I'm going to ask a question for the audience. In the motion, this house, I'll write it down as well, this house opposes art that glorifies the working class. Who are stakeholders you can think of in this debate? Feel free to make suggestions in chat. Okay, so we have the working class. We have people who consume the art. We have the artists who create the art. Anyone else you can think of? Any other stakeholders in this debate? So we might think of also allies to the working class. We might think of the elites as well, the bourgeoisie, if you want to be very bougie about that. We can think of, honestly, many different stakeholders that might be relevant. In the next step, we can dissect these groups, because each of them is not a monolith, obviously. So among working class, we might have those who are white working class versus intersectionally suffering other oppressions. When we talk about people who consume the art, we can talk about those who are more socially aware and look for messages in art. We have those who just like the aesthetic value. We have those who already support the working class and their struggle, those who oppose it, those who don't think of it. Among artists, we might have artists who are working class themselves. They might be creating art on behalf, but not working class themselves. In allies, we can have those who are activists, passive allies, and so on. We can go like this forever. The point is that all of this can help us think of different impacts that the motion has. Because the next question that we are going to ask is, for any of these stakeholders, what impacts them? So for many of them, it will presumably be their values, their self-interested economic needs, peer pressure, and what they feel is expected of them, and so on. By this point, I should already have some intuitive impacts in the debate, because I know who might be impacted in the debate, and I know what are different things that can impact them. The only work left now is to connect the motion to these things. So I can show how art changes values of different groups. I can show how art can change peer pressure. I can show how it interacts with their existing incentives due to their economic needs and so on. And I can analyze each of those differently for different groups to have a myriad of impacts that apply across different groups in the debate. The next question, which I think is less commonly asked, is, sorry, it's not what impacts. What do they impact? Here we have second-degree impacts. So in other words, for each of these groups, we can either directly impact them, but we can also show that the way they change creates expanding circles. Because maybe we can't change people who actively oppose socialism. But if we change the fence-sitters and they create peer pressure or democratic pressure and so on, this might lead to an indirect effect also on those who are actively opposed to the goal. Because maybe we are going to have less of a direct impact on those who consume art in a purely aesthetic manner, and they are not going to easily change their minds based on the art. But if we change the minds of those who do care and look for the message, they will create discourse. And the discourse might change the mind of those who also consume art in a less intellectualized manner. Because even if they don't look for the message in the art itself, when they talk to their friends about it, this is when they might change their opinion. So all of these would be examples of second-degree impact. I think debaters rarely ever use second degree impacts, bar maybe in econ motions where this becomes more intuitive to them. In econ, you would say things like, if an employee earns more money because we increase the minimum wage, this will also indirectly lead to the second degree impact of increased spending, which will create more jobs. This is a classic example of a second degree impact. But the point is that this exists not any less in soft motions as well. When we change one group, this group ends up doing an impact in the world. And I think part of the mindset that can help us think of more ways to impact our arguments is understand that our society is full of day-to-day interactions where people influence each other perpetually. And this can also help us think of further impacts. One last thing I will say on impacts in broad before I get to the specifics on soft impacts is remember that, like many good things in life, impacts are on a spectrum. And I think another common mistake that teams often do, and especially in soft motions, is try and only reach for the most extreme version of the impact or only reach for the most likely version of the impact. Truth of the matter is, most things, most motions, impact different groups in different ways and extents. And this means that you can characterize the same impact at its worst and best case. So in this motion, it would be very common to see teams doing things like, if we have art that glorifies the working class, this means everyone now thinks that the working class are living a good life and have no struggle and should be doing it for the heroism of it and not for the wages and good conditions. And this is when we lose all support for the labor movement. This would be extreme. I think when we actually look at the impact it has on people in real life, we can see a myriad of impacts changing on different groups. So at the extreme end, say, for people who are already mobilized, this art can motivate them to care, push it higher in their intensity of preferences, and go vote or protest on the matter. This would be the extreme end. At a softer level, for those who are undecided, it may at least push them in the right direction. And even if it doesn't end up manifesting into full-on difference in voting patterns, they might treat their own laborers better, which is an impact which is very valid in the world and very important. So if I have a cleaner or a cook or anyone with whom I interact that is doing manual labor and blue-collar jobs, I might be more willing to say thank you based on how I'm impacted by the art, or pay them a tip, or lay them off and let them have a day off, and so on. And for those who actively oppose, at the most difficult end of the spectrum, at the very least, they are likely to be more ashamed of their opinion and not actively act against the struggle, which is also an impact. Refraining from action is also an impact. It's changing the world, if otherwise they would have acted. So this is the example of impacts being on a spectrum. Another common example, I think, is often useful to explain this principle, and we can do a quick practice of this now. In the motion, this house would pay salaries to housewives. Say that we are Gov, and we want to run the argument that this will create more independence for women who are currently very dependent on their husbands and therefore have no proper autonomy in life. So what would be the extreme end of the spectrum characterization here? Which stakeholder in this debate would be the extreme end? Any thoughts? Who are different groups or stakeholders in this debate? Those who oppose the idea are not the ones who are the stakeholders of this argument, because in this argument, we are only trying to impact housewives. What are different groups of housewives? Can we dissect them? Okay. So we can have very conservative families. On the other end of the spectrum, we can have those who do it out of choice. Now, usually, when I hear this argument on salaries to housewives and giving them more autonomy, the sort of impact I would hear is something around the following lines. In conservative families, the husband is often very coercive and limiting towards the housewife. They have no shared bank account. She needs to ask his permission for every expense, yada, yada. Now, what would you say is the problem with this impact? It's probably true, but what makes it less compelling than it could have been? Not everyone at once. What would you respond to this argument if you were up? Okay, so if you're going to try and prove this is insufficient, yes, okay, thank you. If you're going to try and prove this is insufficient or tokenistic, this is fine, you can do it, but then you're conceding the metric and you're trying to fight on the same metric. If you're trying to rebut the impact, what you can say here easily is this is very extreme. This is not how most families with housewives operate. There is at least some degree of choice or agency involved. In which case, can we think of a more nuanced version of this impact? Can we think down the spectrum in more liberal households or where housewives do this out of choice? Why is it still limiting to their autonomy? Say that your husband is not imposing economic violence. Why would it still be imposing on your autonomy to a large extent? Any ideas? Can you think maybe from the perspective of a housewife? Try and reverse engineer the analysis you're going at here. If you're trying to prove that she would not feel at liberty to spend their money as she sees fits, how would you do that? What is she likely to feel or think? So if we're trying to think about it from the questions above of what impacts them, what could impact a housewife's choice, her degree of liberty, her feeling of freedom to pay as she wants on what she wants? Say that she wants to make a big expense, maybe sign up for a college degree, which is expensive, and her husband isn't forbidding it. Why might she not do it, even though she really wants to? They have a shared bank account, she can. Yes, if she is self-censoring, if she's feeling that this money is not truly hers, this is still not perfect autonomy. She might technically have access to the money, but if we can show that the degree of self-blame involved with every expense when it's out of her husband's income is so severe that she nearly never buys anything she wants, this is still not autonomy. And this is how we show this impact to also apply down the spectrum, just in a softer version of it. And the importance of this is dual. It both means that now our impact is relevant to a much larger group of families, but also, and perhaps more importantly, this is the impact that is likely to stand by the end of the debate. The reason is very simple. The more extreme we go, maybe our impact will be harder, but it's also going to be more symmetric. Because the more extreme our characterization is, the harder it is to show that the emotion has any impact of it. If my husband is truly an abusive prick who is going to try and impose economic violence on me, even if I get my own money, I can still have limitations on it. He would still begrudge me every time I spend of the family money, even if it is my own. It is in the more liberal household that this is actually making a difference. So this is another reason why it's important to think of impacts in terms of a spectrum of varying degrees. Are there questions so far on impacts in general? Okay, I'll take it as a no, though I see we're being very engaging here. Soft impacts in particular. So I am kind of guessing here because some of the questions were a bit all over the place about what kind of motions you imagine to be soft. But usually when people say soft motions and soft impacts, they refer to things like narratives, relationships, education, feminism, and so on. Everything that is not a very clear-cut, immediate change in the world via policy or warfare or econ, but rather operating in more indirect ways through changing our patterns of thinking and social dynamics, and in the long run, leading to social change. And this is when many people get stuck for thinking of impacts. Here, I want to offer a few guidelines that might help you get out of it. First is, and usually the easiest one, are there any metrics that are considered in the debate? So an important note is if the whole motion is soft, if the motion is about art or relationships or whatnot, this is when teams have an incentive to agree that the motion has an impact. It would be a very weird strategy from either prop or op in the debate about art that glorifies the working class to say, guys, art doesn't change anything in real life. No one cares. Because that would undermine the impacts of both sides. There are strategical ways to go about saying art usually doesn't make any difference. Here are the only instances in which it does and why they only fall on our side. But it's very unlikely for someone to say there's no impact at all. And when the metric in the debate is considered, it then becomes much easier because we don't have to prove our metric to matter. The more difficult task is when we are running a soft case in an otherwise hard motion. So if there is a debate, say, on depictions of the full horrors of war in media, you surely know this one, right? That would be, this house would ban depictions of the full horrors of war in media. And then say that you're extending and top half is running full on the two clashes of how it impacts willingness to go into war and how it impacts perception and accountability against war crimes. These are like tough, high impact things, right? And then you're from bottom half, your CG, and you're running, this is triggering for individuals with PTSD. And it's not to say that we don't care. Of course we care. It is important in a vacuum. But how do we go about proving the importance of it relatively in a debate that is so far about war and people dying and torture? And we are proving an argument to which the impact is effectively bad feels. How do you impact bad feels as meaning anything in a debate about war? So there are several tactics to go about here. Firstly, can we frame the soft impact as the one that is more likely or more relevant in the debate? In this example, do you have an idea of how you would do this if you are CG? Any thoughts? Right, I feel like the attempt to make this interactive has failed. So, question. Do you think the actual main thing that impacts people's willingness to go into war is this motion? When people go out and vote or protest or rally their politicians to go into war or to end a war, what motivates them? Go back to the previous questions we asked, right? What impacts them? What do they impact and so on? And I think the answer here in this debate, these clashes are significantly less impacted by the motion than PTSD. Because this full horrors of war thing is just one of a myriad of different messages that play into how people think about war. This is because people have rational and not only emotional considerations, body counts, and so on. This is because people hear stories, even if they don't see the full horrors of war. They know people who have met, they hear the speeches of the troops and so on. There are so many different things, and not to mention the connection between when you see the full horrors of war and when you go out and vote is disconnected. You don't immediately think of it at the moment. The connection of when you see these images and experience a trigger is immediate. This means that the probability of this impact coming about as a result of the motion is like 99%. Whereas the probability of this impact coming about from the motion is much smaller. It's much more speculative. It still doesn't decisively prove that it wins, but this is how we start going about impacting a soft impact in a hard motion. A second question that we can often ask ourselves is, why do people care in real life? What's the reason? Because usually the arguments we are running are arguments that we didn't just make up to sound soft, but because we think someone actually believes in them. And the question could be why. So I'll give you a classic example of this. In the motion, this house would ban cigarettes. Say that you are up, and the argument you are running is super simple. People enjoy cigarettes. It's fun. It's relaxing. It's a social habit. It gives them good vibes. Now, government is going to have dead people on their hands, right? Cigarettes kill. How do you weigh it's fun over cigarettes kill? So likelihood is part of it, sure. I want you to go a bit farther than the purely logical part. I would posit that most people in real life who oppose banning cigarettes oppose it for this reason. Why? Why do they care so much that it's fun? Okay, a common mistake that I keep seeing you do is when you are trying to weigh or impact using a rebuttal. So say the impact on health doesn't matter that much because people would still consume illegally. This is not the point of neither an impact or a weighing. You can try and win the debate by purely mitigating the other side to non-existence. But the whole point of what we do when we impact or weigh is recognize that debates exist on a trade-off. There's a bullet to bite. The other side will get some wins, and we need to show why ours are sufficiently important to win against them. So resist the temptation to rebut. In fact, often a weighing drill I give when people ask me how to practice weighing is watch a speech, like watch a PM speech, watch an LO speech. You're a DPM, your job is to weigh the PM's material over the LO's material. One caveat, you're not allowed to do any rebuttal. You have to concede every single thing LO says. This is how you actually force yourself to do impacting and weighing and not just resort to rebuttals because it's easier. Guys, are chocolate cakes particularly healthy? Yes, I think the last comment by Natsuki here is actually getting there. People do things that are fun and dangerous all the time, knowingly and consciously, because this is a trade-off we are happy to make in life. It's not just the easy analogy of we all eat sugar, even though we know it increases chances for diabetes. We all cross the street every single day knowing that we might get hit by a car and we have zero impact on it. This is a natural part of life and it's fine. It is the proven preference that people themselves make that this is of more importance because most people prefer it. Another example of this was in the motion, this house prefers a world without sexual attraction. And once I was opposition in this debate. And I shit you not, the argument I won the debate with was sex is fun. Really that simple. Now keep in mind, governments ran a bunch of stuff on why a world without sexual attraction will have significantly less sexual violence. And I am here trying to weigh sex is fun over sexual violence. And the way I did it was very simple. Panel, most women enjoy sex and choose to opt into this, despite knowing that sex is dangerous for them. Because all women are born into a world where they learn from a very young age that there are dangers involved in sex. And they are taking this risk consciously and willingly. People are willing to make the trade-off. The main reason why a real person would not prefer not having sexual attraction if they had the option is because they enjoy it. And it's worth for them all the heartbreak and even the risks associated. So don't shy away from bringing debate land back into the real world, because this often helps bring the intuition for why your arguments are important. Next tactic. Can we think of similar instances which we do care about? So even if we don't know in this particular example, in this particular debate, we'll care in real life, we can often think of analogies. A common analogy I used in many debates when I needed to weigh something soft over something hard is the analogy about driving. If we put a speed limit of 10 miles per hour, I guarantee you there would be significantly less traffic accidents. People are dying because of traffic accidents. Why don't we do it? Why don't we limit speed limits to 10 miles per hour in all streets? Do we think that money and economic growth is more important than human lives? The answer is yes. At some scale and some extent, the answer is yes. We are willing to take risks when people are opting into those risks because we think they are worth the trade-off. So this is another useful tactic. Are the impacts really soft, or are we underselling them? Is another valuable question. So when we think of, for example, the PTSD example, I think what people often just skip analyzing is really what PTSD is. What's trauma? What's a trigger? We throw around these buzzwords frequently, and this could make it sound like it's just a bad feeling. If we can actually go into the depth of characterizing, for someone who has a traumatic experience and sees this on a screen, they now immediately relive this experience in their head. They are losing the control and their judgment of what's reality and what's then, because it is such a strong memory that it takes over their frame of thought. This is when they reimagine being in the same position. It is as scary as being in the same position again. What we are imposing on them is analogous to throwing them again on the battlefield. This is something that could take them months to recover from, because once the initial trigger was brought about after they've done a process that was very lengthy and difficult to get over it, they might get rehashes of this in nightmares again and again and again. We actually can show that there is a real impact. Many times when we say something is soft, is because we are underthinking it and we are underselling it. Another common tactic is thinking of a cumulative effect. So oftentimes, soft impacts will have not a lot of, impact when we think of them as an insular occasion, but they will accumulate into something very significant. So, hold on, there's a question in the chat. Okay, so someone in the chat asked, wouldn't it be easy for OP to say that it is such an extreme experience that they are likely to just not opt in the first place? I'm going to answer this once, and this will be the last time I answer this in the full form of the answer. I'm going to name this answer rebutophobia, and whenever I say rebutophobia, I refer to this again. Rebuttals are not a problem in the argument. Every argument has rebuttals, literally every single one. The strongest argument you've ever seen in a debate has rebuttals. It's not a reason not to run the argument. It's just a reason to analyze it better. So if they're going to say, oh, they might as well just not opt into watching it, okay, then we prove that there's not a meaningful opt-in. Like sometimes people play the news around you when you didn't choose it, or you zap between channels and you incidentally jump and stop on it without intending to, and so on. It's not that hard, but the point is the existence of a rebuttal should not deter you from running anything ever. Awesome. Moving back. So to give an example of what I mean by a cumulative effect, say in the motion, this house, which one is a good example of this? Okay. This house supports genderless parenting, with genderless parenting being described as raising kids without awareness of their gender, not assigning them a gender at birth, letting them discover it themselves, and throughout their upbringing, exposing them exclusively, like exposing them consistently to toys associated with both traditional genders and clothes and whatnot, until they end up choosing their own. Now, let's say from Gov, I want to run the argument that gender norms are coercive on kids and are therefore effectively limiting their choice. If I were to describe just one interaction, such as boy wants to play with doll, other kid laughs at boy, boy drops doll and does not do what boy enjoys, this sounds very fluff on face value. Both because, okay, so what's the big deal? He will go home and play with his dolls then when the other kids don't watch. And by the way, important note, opposition can still support parents being liberal on their side. They can happily say, raise your child to be a boy who loves dancing and playing with dolls, consistent with their stance, no issue, but still assign gender. So firstly, they can say, you'll have many spaces where you have the freedom to do what you want. Secondly, okay, so what? So you don't play with dolls. Please go show me the link between not playing with dolls all the way to you can't express emotions. Show me the link between girls not playing soccer all the way into girls not doing STEM studies. If you're going to look at an insular incident, it is hard. But if we are able to describe the accumulative effect, because this motion is about raising kids for many years, and we can show why, sure, such an insular incident is meaningless. But if throughout the childhood of that kid, when they grow up, every single time they seek feedback from society, they get positive feedback for gender affirming behavior and negative feedback for gender non-affirmative behavior, this is when they learn what is the societal expectation. And next time they won't even wait for someone to laugh at them. This is why when they later on start assigning this to new things such as STEM or whatnot, this is already becoming an associative experience that they have subconsciously into their decision-making process. So this would be how we show why an insular event might not be very impactful. But when you experience it many, many, many times and have many reaffirmations of it, it can actually change your mindset. Another trick is, again, just asking, could they have second degree larger impacts? So even if the impact we have on someone is soft, we want to show how this leads to an impact that is large. The most classic example of this is any and all backlash arguments. So a lot of people run backlash and stop at the impact of, and this is why conservatives will not like us. This will make conservatives be more antagonistic against gay people. I don't know. And the real answer to this should always be, who cares? So they're mad, and then what? People being mad is not yet an impact. This is, I think, the common mistake. People being mad and as a result of it, being more likely to commit hate crimes or more likely to vote for LGBT-phobic parties or more likely to discriminate against queer people in their workplace or more likely to be not accepting of their child when they come out of the closet. This is impact. It is an extension of saying people will be mad, people will be antagonistic, but it is translating it into the second degree of what it actually does in the world. Never stop at any impact in people's heads. Show how they operate based on what's in their head. Another question could be, could their interactions with other soft impacts in the world lead to a hard impact? So even if an impact in itself is soft, if we have a lot of different soft impacts in the world that interact with each other, they might end up leading to a hard impact. The most common way of running these arguments is what many of you might be familiar with as tipping point analysis. This is saying some populations are already so on the edge that even a soft impact can make a big difference for them. So say in the motion, this house opposes TV shows that center on the life of people suffering from extreme depression. Often you would try and analyze the argument. This leads to kids getting more depressed and even attempting self-harm and suicide. And this sounds extremely speculative when you say it on face value. Can you take someone who is happy, show them a TV show, and suddenly they'll get depressed? Is that how clinical depression works? Probably not. But if we can characterize the group that is most likely to be attracted to these shows in the first place, the group that finds most resonating with the main characters are those who are already experiencing some degree of depression. And then seeing someone inspiring them on how to do it, seeing the specific instructions of how they end up committing self-harm, seeing the aftermath and all of their enemies feeling sorry for it and so on, might be the tipping point that pushes them over the edge. So soft impacts can be a straw that broke the camel's back in some instances. A next potential method is mapping who is particularly vulnerable to those impacts. This is a bit similar here, but sometimes an impact that is soft for most people is hard for others. A common example, in the motion, this house would ban advertisements. One of the easiest ways to win from up is prove advertisements lead to free many things because sponsorships, particularly free internet. The reason the internet is free is because you're the product. Now, a common rebuttal I hear, at least when I coach in whiter environments, is, oh, but if they would just have to pay for access to the internet, how much would it cost? $5 a month? Who can't afford $5 a month? Now, given this is not an extremely white environment, can you guys answer who can't afford $5 a month if that would be the cost of internet? Many poor people, particularly in developing countries where the power purchasing parity is very, very low. So mapping the individuals that are most vulnerable is often helpful, especially if you can map the likely individuals in the debate as being vulnerable. So an example of this I did earlier with the idea of depressed teens are the ones who watch depressed shows. Another one is a classic Adam Huxley example. So in the motion, fancy info slide, but basically the motion is this house would form LGBT only schools for kids. So like schools that the only kids who go to them are LGBT. Usually, what we're going to get in this debate as the trade-off is something around the following lines, yes? Gov will say something like safer space throughout high school. Op will say not preparing for life, won't learn to handle and engage with hetero cis people. And then you need to start weighing off between them. And a very nice framing to impact this Gov case is just characterizing the population of LGBT youth. What do we know about LGBT youth? What are they very vulnerable to? So of course they all suffer bullying, but we want to make this bullying sound big and impactful, right? Not just bad feels to make Op say, okay, but they will learn how to fight their bullies. Guys, LGBT teenagers are one of the most prone populations to depressive disorders in like the extreme ends. About 10% of LGBT youth will attempt suicide. It's more than 40% for trans community. The important framing here is this is not preparation for life. In order for this to become preparation for life, they need to survive it. They need to actually learn coping mechanisms and not just suffer. If this is a population that is extremely vulnerable to the harms of bullying, because of many reasons that we can characterize for why many of them are on the more extreme edge of the depressive disorder spectrum, we should just prioritize the short term. Because when they grow up, for many reasons, it will balance out. They will be better equipped to handle the bullies. But when they're 15, it might just be too much for them. So this is how we use framing on populations that are more vulnerable to our impacts. And lastly, we can ask ourselves, does fiat in the motion make an otherwise soft impact become actually hard impact? Because motions in debate always have fiat, which is a very powerful tool, and I think people don't weaponize it enough. So if we think as an example of the motion, this house prefers a world where let's go with, actually, I think I've got an example for this in advance. Let's take, yes. This is an example of a motion that was set previously by the UADC core, by the way. I like using those when we are before UADC. This house prefers a world where humans are optimistic about the future of the world rather than have an objectively accurate assessment of it. On face value, does this motion seem soft or hard to you? It seems soft, right? My optimism, realism, just classical narrative debate. Note two things that the motion tells you because of how it's worded that suddenly make it an extremely impactful debate. One, this house prefers a world. What do we know of this house prefers a world motions? How do they differ from this house believes that we should and so on, or this believe it will be better if? What's unique to this house prefers a world motions? Okay, because we are running out of time, I'm going to answer this. Hindsight / retrospective analysis. This house prefers a world is from the dawn of history. Step backwards. This is now no longer a motion about should people today be more optimistic or pessimistic. This is a motion that can change the whole course of human history. This is a motion that means when humans decided to take leaps of faith with new things such as vaccines, they would be optimistic or realistic about it. When humans were considering changing regimes, starting revolutions for democracy, they would consider optimism versus realism. Immediately, this debate becomes much more impactful. Secondly, can prop in this debate argue that people can't have an objective, accurate assessment of the future? What do you think? The answer is no. The motion has fiat. If the motion says this house prefers X rather than Y, prop defends a world where X, op defends a world where Y. If prop is going to say you can't have an objective accurate assessment, op says, sucks to be you. You can't have an objective accurate assessment of it in your world. In my world, I have fiat that they do. You're just arguing against the motion. Immediately, super impactful. We are now creating a population that is very good in making realistic assessments. Is it clear how a motion that may seem soft on face value can become very impactful if you actually notice how burdens in the motion and fiat change the impact of the motion? Okay, let's move on to answer some questions that you guys had. Is it a good idea to narrow down a vague motion to a very specific stakeholder or try to impact the debate broadly? This is one of my favorite genre of questions, which begs the answer, it depends. This very much depends on what the motion is. So the answer is, in AP, usually I would not do this. I think the best strategical advantage of doing this, if you can, is locking bottom half out of the debate if you are able to narrow the debate down so much that there's no extensions left. In AP, this advantage is diminished. The broader answer is, if you can do it, be careful. Make sure that you're not escaping burdens in the motion because you're trying to. I like narrowing down debates if I can, to make my impact the only thing that changes in the debate. But usually, if the CAs thought well about how they word their motions, this should not be easy to do. And this might mean that you're escaping a burden in the motion. So usually err on the side of just going along with the broader debate and impact all of it, unless you're very confident that you can have a very narrowed down aspect of it. I'll give an example of one incident where I think you can have a very narrowed down definition. I recall another motion that was set before is this house prefers a world where romantic attraction or romantic love isn't perceived as the primary consideration in marriage. This is a classic motion where I would definitely narrow down the scope of the debate, because it's this house prefers a world and it sounds huge, but it's extremely easy for me to make the motion very, very small if I want to, and then use it for my advantage. One, this motion is only relevant starting like early 20th century onwards, because for most of human history, this wasn't a difference, right? For most of human history, marriage was not traditionally love marriage. It was based on matchmaking and so on, and your parents would be very much involved. Secondly, this motion is only relevant in somewhat, at least, liberal or secular communities, because in a lot of parts of the world, this motion is already status quo. Love is not a primary consideration. Thirdly, on both sides of the debate, love is a consideration. Only difference is it's not the primary consideration. And when I do that, I can mitigate my burden from prop a fair bit. Because now it's the burden on op to prove an absolute, that we absolutely have to have love above all else. I can still consider it. Parents care about their children's happiness and they ask them if they love their partner, yada, yada. But you're also going to consider other things. And this becomes harder to opt then. But in most debates, it's not very easy to narrow the debate a lot without escaping your burden. Like, I would not try to do it in this debate. I think it's very hard to narrow down this debate. This debate is huge. How different is impacting from weighing? I addressed this one at the beginning of the workshop. Impacts are, or weighings are impact plus comparative element. Is there any standard structure or framework to come up with multiple impacts? Okay, this is what we did at the beginning of this workshop. Online debates and recommendations. This is a tricky one. There are many debates that have good impacting. I think I think Madrid World's Open Semi was a decent example. I think Korea Worlds, I believe it was the Octo, the motion on language generating AI, is one where it's hard to come up intuitively with the impacts, and I think they, in some rooms they did it quite well. But more broadly, I think the question of what do you want to look for and watch to learn impacting will heavily rely on what kind of impacts do you struggle with, because the top level debaters in all motions will do impacting always. The question is kind of what do you struggle with impacting? So if you struggle with impacting narrative debates and so on, Madrid World Open Semi was a very much narrative centered debate. This is impacting of something that intuitively people don't understand why it's impactful, right? Like language generating AI, at least at the time, unlike other forms of AI, seems very niche, specifically about literature and so on. So if you struggle with impacting soft motions, just watch debates from very high level debates about soft motions. How should impacting be split across speaker roles? This depends on your team dynamic. Usually, I'm in favor of they should already come from first speaker. I think weighings can come from the second and third speaker, but I think understanding why the argument is important in a vacuum, at least, even if not comparatively, is important already in first speeches, if not for any other reason, because this is how you grab the judge's attention. For them to actually be motivated to properly listen to you and write down everything you say, they need to understand why they care. And if they don't understand why they care, they just will stop writing. However, it would very much depend on your team dynamics. I am also a huge believer in comparative advantage and what each speaker does better. So my strategy on what to include as first speaker and what not changed a lot from when I was speaking with Maya and when I was speaking with Tamal. Because Maya was a very, very engagement and strategy oriented only kind of speaker. And therefore, all of the constructive analysis would have to come from my speech. And I left all of the engagement to Maya. I nearly never rebutted in Thai worlds. Whereas Tamal is more comfortable as well with analysis. So oftentimes I will afford to do more of the refutation and strategy in my own speech, and she can run a different constructive argument. So this is very much a question of what your comfort zone is. Okay, there's a question in the chat. Do I always approach the motion the way introduced in the lectures, stakeholders dissecting what impacts them? Subconsciously, yes, proactively, no. So the answer is there are a lot of skills that take time when you start doing them and then come about quickly after you practice them for a while? Initially, the answer is yes. When I started, I very much operated on a very practical and technical approach to preps. And I asked myself those guiding questions and I used them like a Bible. The more arguments and impacts started coming to me intuitively because I did it a lot, the less I needed to be so technical. But I do believe the thought process I do behind this is still this. I just do it more subconsciously now. I don't actively write on my sheet, what are the stakeholders, dissect, yada, yada. It just comes at a flash. But this is a practice makes perfect kind of thing. Okay, do you guys have any more questions? Okay, good luck in UADC.